Hi everyone, and welcome to the Odd Ducklings podcast, where we talk about neurodivergent life, careers, and everything in between. My name is Daria, and I will be your host. Today we have a really exciting episode. Besides the intro that you may have already noticed, let me know what you think about that one. We're also diving into a subject that is very dear to me, and to be honest, is kind of at the core of this podcast. We are going to go a bit meta, talking about neurodivergency and how it's neither a superpower nor a disease. It's just a different way for a brain to function. And we will be doing this with none other than Benjamin Stimson, who, honestly, I think should represent himself. Benjamin, tell us a bit more about yourself.
Oh, that's always a big question. I'm a therapist, I'm an author, published author, a researcher in medieval history and religious studies. So I've got kind of many different hats. I'm located in Ontario, Canada, but I'm originally from North Wales in the UK.
We will be touching quite a bit about all of these changes you've had with where you are located and where you live. You've had the great opportunity to live in English-speaking countries, but naturally that doesn't mean it was easy. And I think we will definitely be diving into that one. Before we do that, some fun questions that I want to ask you. These are on topic, but also not exactly. What is the best or worst advice that you've ever received?
I think the best advice I've ever received was to stop living in the past, that I don't belong there. That was one of the biggest pieces. And I think the worst piece of advice I've ever received was, ironically, by somebody who I once looked up to. And they said to me that I need to learn to be able to receive from others without fearing those gifts. And unfortunately, that situation was a misunderstanding because I grew up in a household where everything was conditional. And so that idea that I just need to accept anything given to me, whether it be conditional or unconditional, just accept it, was one of the worst pieces of advice.
Okay, that sounds like a very specific situation. And I wonder, because it feels like there's some connection between the two.
Absolutely. And this kind of ties into my whole life story, my whole situation with my neurodivergence too. I grew up in a household, and I love my parents to bits, absolutely adore them. But our family culture is very much transactional and conditional. So affection, love is not consciously understood to be this way, but it is. It's conditional. So I grew up knowing that if I wanted something, that it would always be conditional. If I was, given support or offered support on something, oftentimes it would be brought up later against me, or if I wasn't reciprocating, everything had strings attached. And again, very subconscious way of the family structure. And a situation where that's filtered out into my regular life, where I often don't trust when people are out of the blue offering and just being generous, right? And that generosity piece has caused a lot of issues for me in my life. And so individual misunderstood why I wouldn't want to accept assistance really from somebody, particularly my parents, but also from them. And they assumed that it was because I needed to get over something, as opposed to understanding that, oftentimes my relationship with generosity in life, and I'm learning to overcome it, but that generosity piece always has strings attached. So I'm very cautious about taking something without then giving something back. That worst piece of advice was very dismissive, and it came from somebody who I would have thought that would have known me. But I think what makes it the worst piece of advice for me was that relationship piece. And that really ties into that other piece of advice, don't live in the past. For the longest time, because of my own life circumstances and whatnot, I really clung to the past because I didn't really see a future for myself. And I didn't see a future for myself because I didn't see the support in my life. Yeah. I hope that makes sense.
I think I will add on top of this an advice to an extent, because I hope that if you look at your life today, you can take this bad advice and actually find it applicable as a good advice. It only, at the time, it was not fitting the situation. And then my advice would be seek advice, but be cautious of implementing it.
Very much so. Very much so. And that's part and parcel with building boundaries. So building boundaries, gaining boundaries, affirming boundaries. And I have noticed that, particularly since I became a published author, I've noticed that other people who don't have very strong boundaries, aren't used to people having strong boundaries, can take somebody affirming their boundaries in a very negative way. And so that's a big lesson piece there. Those two of not living in the past, but also learning to accept generosity just as, also comes with needing to affirm boundaries, which is if you're offering something, it can't be conditional unless that's agreed to, right? And that's a boundary piece. Yeah.
I love it. It's taking me down such a long line of thoughts. That's a whole different conversation to the one we came to be having. So I'm going to jump directly to the meat and potato. So you touched on now that I'm accomplished, now that I'm successful. And I love it. You can say this about yourself. And I know the feeling of like, maybe not as much like shying away from taking ownership of this because it's so scary. But you are, in fact, published not only once, you are an academic and you have so much to give and such an incredible internet presence that you open up online unconditionally. Yeah, so tell us a bit about where you are now. Do not be humble. Share with us your successes at this point.
Well, I appreciate that. I really do appreciate that. Thank you. So taking us back, 2015, I see as being kind of my rebirth year. I really re-engaged with life after about 5 years of really floundering. 2010, I was in a bachelor program. I had to drop out of it because of my own mental health stuff. And for 5 years, I just kept floundered about. I worked for my parents in the family business, which wasn't healthy, but it was helpful, I should say. It was something to do. But I didn't have direction in my life. And so in 2015, I started to engage with what do I want to do? What do I want to be in my life? And that's led to now, which is I went back to finish my bachelor's. I changed course on that. I ended up going and doing what I really wanted to do back in 2010, as opposed to what I was doing. I ended up doing medieval studies, history, doing all these really cool, interesting things that I have loved ever since I was a kid. And it was a breeze. I mean, I don't want to say I didn't put a lot of effort and work into it, because I did. But going back as a mature student, going back as somebody who already has all of that background from an amateur point of view, it was just fun. It was fun to go back and study on my own time as well. I was working part-time. I was supporting myself through my therapy work too. I was in a very different position there. And so that was great. In 2017 to 2019, I'd gone back and retrained as a psychotherapist. I did that training to kind of try to re-engage, try to find a new approach. During the pandemic, I wrote a book and I spent a year writing, which was fabulous. And when it came out in September, I ended up contracting with another publisher for another book, which I just finished during the spring, and now it's coming out in June of next year. I've got another one already on the go. So all of these pieces came together, and I was supported through that process. Certainly there were a lot of people involved in those processes, either by supporting me through doing that, by offering me an email or connecting with people, or even just networking. I spent a lot of time networking with fellow authors and other members in these various fields. And so I feel like I'm accomplished. I'm becoming successful because of all the hard work I've put in since 2015. And it's really been one after another. They're all daisy-chained and they're all linked in that way. And so sitting now, I feel ambitious. I have plans that I want to do. I'm moving back to the UK, hopefully in the next 6 to 8 months. And so I have a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah. Honestly, I mean, you already touched on so many topics, right? And like, not just on where you are, because you were humble despite directions, and about the process. Mm-hmm. And I think, I'm just messing with you, honestly. I think the bottom line is a lot of us come to the table and we want to say proudly what we do, but we also want to say proudly what we had to go through, which is a conversation that is rather new because of social media, because we have these platforms. And I'm very happy that you do it so openly. And
To be fair, that is a cultural thing too. So my parents are both from the north of England, and working class, middle class background culture is very much when you're successful. And this is one of those negative, unhealthy parts of the culture is when you're successful, you have to make sure that other people know you earned it, because unearned success is seen as a disrespect to the rest of the culture. So there's a part of that in there too. But certainly that North American piece certainly has come out. I mean, growing up in North America, we're very much focused on the individual success and celebrating the individual. So it's me being in between two cultures there.
all right. So you already talked about the elephant in the room. Tell us a bit about moving. What was your first move from the UK to Canada? I think we only generally touched this, and also how that was different from you because of your neurodivergency.
Absolutely. So to touch on the neurodivergency piece. So when I was a child, I lived in Wales until I was 8.5 years old. My parents were publicans over there. They had moved from England about 10 years before. So they're English and Welsh. And most of my siblings are dyslexic. I developed dyspraxia. Similar but different.
When you said this the first time, I said like dyslexia, right? And it's a lot more common. So because there might be people listening to this who might not know what it is, if you could just give a bit of an explanation.
Absolutely. So I often like to think of it, and it's often said about it, that dyspraxia is like dyslexia, except it's motor control. So whereas dyslexia is putting together concepts and having issues around comprehension, around that deciphering of visual information, symbolic information, dyspraxia is a motor control issue. It's a neurological disorder where oftentimes people will not be able to coordinate their motor control in a set way. Oftentimes just will manifest as people being clumsy, and I'm using air quotes there. People who are maybe having issues, they may stumble, they might appear just like generally clumsy, right? With me and quite a few other people like me, it didn't affect my gross motor controls. It affected my fine motor controls, which was, for me at least, the inability to form words in my mouth because I wasn't able to put the order of motor control in there. So if I was trying to speak, and comprehension-wise, I learned English like everybody else, like all other children, but I couldn't form the words. And how it would often come out is like if I was saying, say, baby, I would say, baby, or I would try, I'd be able to comprehend, but I wouldn't be able to put it in. So I had to go through speech therapy for many years. I started out in nursery school and then ended up doing speech therapy right up until really I left the UK. And so for me, it was having to learn how to speak, how to coordinate the fine motors in my mouth. And it also affected things like my hands, so like writing, things like that. So I had to physically lay down those brain patterns in order to do that. Now, I still deal with it. It's something that's always going to be with me. How it affects neurodivergency then is I think differently because of it. I tend to put ideas together differently. And also, when I'm tired, I start to slur my words. I have a slight lisp that is only detectable for certain things. But it also affects how I write. So, for example, most neurotypical people will, when they're forming words, they'll go from, is it bottom to top? Whereas I do it top to bottom. Or I do it the opposite from neuro people, right? And that's where the connection with dyslexia comes in. Because oftentimes dyslexics can form, like even just where they start, right? So in some cultures, it actually doesn't appear, because it's all a continuum, depending on the lexicon and how people write, they may not even be able to see it because that is how they write. So top, bottom, or bottom, top, right? Or left to right and so forth, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm definitely trying to think how do I write? And I have no idea. It's like a
subconscious thing, right? Yeah.
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 How would someone find out that they have that specific neurodiversity and do something about it?
When I was diagnosed in the really early 1990s, very different time when it came to, there is a Dyspraxics Association, similar to the Dyslexics Association in the UK. And at that time, the UK and Europe in general was much further ahead than North America when it came to this diagnosis. They did various tests. I can only vaguely remember what testing was, but they first determined that there was an issue. Because at 3.5, I wasn't speaking. I was mumbling, I was babbling, but I wasn't speaking. But I had comprehension. I obviously could understand what was being said to me, but I just couldn't speak. So what they ended up testing, looking up symptoms, and there was a language unit for North Wales that my mum was able to fight for me to go and get a test through. So it's sitting with the language therapist for an hour. I would go through, and they wanted to see if I could associate ideas with images. So they would have like plastic cows, plastic animals, and they would then ask me point to the word on a sheet, and I could point to a word on the sheet where it came back positive that yes, he probably is dyspraxic. So what they did was they would taxi me down from my school in my little village down to another school about 20 minutes away, and I think I went there like 3 times a week until eventually I was permanently there for a year. And it was language unit. So I would go, and they taught me a form of sign language so that I could sign what my needs were, called Macron 2. And I vaguely remember like a couple of the signs there, like very basic form of sign language, like tapping my elbow was cookie, for example, right? So very simple until I was able to verbalize.
So you mentioned that this is something that you did almost up to the point where you left, or just up until the point where you left to Canada. What does it do to your self-esteem? Is it building it? Is it taking it down? Also changing cultures?
This is the thing. So we were very lucky. My parents kept all of their old files from the UK, and I actually came across, and I have it somewhere, the reports from back then when they were testing me. And what came through again and again was that my family and my friends and my school teachers normalized this, because this language unit I was attending, and also at my own school, had other kids who were dealing with things, whatever they were dealing with, right? But the onus on it was normalizing. So to me, I was just living my life. It never came up. I never felt like I was different. I just knew that every so often I would go and spend an hour with Mary Humphreys, and then I would come back and it would be time for recess, or we would have a lesson on something, or we would be watching television on something, right? So it was a very normal process. It was never raised as an issue. No, I never heard any of the other kids that I was growing up with say anything negative. And that really helped, because to me, it was just a normal part of my life, right?
That absolutely attests to the power of society, building kids positively.
My understanding is that the UK has regressed on that. The state of education there in the past 30 years has deteriorated. But I mean, that's an issue all around the world, right? In that particular era, normalizing and the support that I was receiving was just incredible. And this is like rural, small village Wales, right? It's like, so all of that changed when I came to Canada, because I came to Canada when I was 8.5 years old. Already I was different. And a lot of people know this who have an immigrant or have an immigrant experience or have moved from one culture to another. I wasn't British until I moved to Canada, if that makes sense, right? I wasn't British until I moved to Canada. Suddenly, I was in a very similar kind of landscape, a very small town, so it felt like home in that way. But I had an accent. I spoke differently. I thought differently. I went from a classroom of 15 kids to a classroom of 35. That's how different the two elementary systems were. All of my cultural cues were different. Like the television shows I grew up with in the UK, very different from the ones that were on TV in Canada. I didn't grow up with any of these kids, so forming friendships was a bit of an issue. And also I had a lisp, and they didn't understand what dyspraxia was. So they assumed that it was dyslexia. And so they put me into a reading group. I didn't need a reading group. I needed support. So there wasn't any support. There wasn't any ability to be supportive. And the reading group was literally sitting around with other kids who all of them had different needs. And we were just in a reading group, and that was it. And that was baseline support. So it really atrophied for me. It really atrophied for me.
We touched on this a bit before, that we want to kind of establish that, yes, moving different countries is different, as you said, for people with neurodivergency. What was the difference from you as a neurodivergent versus a neurotypical person going through this change?
I think for me, it comes down to all of the cultural symbolism and cultural understanding. One aspect of the way that I think is that I tend to be very connected to rules. So rules are very important for me. If something doesn't make sense from a rule perspective, then I'll often ignore it. Now, that is also a symptom of like being on the spectrum, which I'm not sure. I don't have a diagnosis around that. But that neurodiverse kind of approach to this is the rule, this is what makes sense. So when I came from the UK, there was a certain cultural understanding, but it was very different in North America. My vocabulary was different. And this is a very typical thing for, people my age. A lot of people in their 30s grew up with this type of programming on the BBC, on ITV and Channel 4. And so our vocabulary tends to be a little bit older, a little bit more advanced. And I'm not saying that with any judgment involved.
I learned English from Monty Python. It's very noticeable sometimes.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and this is the thing. You can usually tell, you can hear that. So it's very interesting.
What I love about your point is that, so I migrated to Germany about 6 years ago, where I have no language ability. And the cultural shock that I experienced must be actually more like your experience than I thought it would be. Because to me, it was like, oh, you are lucky. You migrated to a country with the language that you already know. But
right.
It's not really the case, is it? It's so vastly different.
And we see this even within different countries, right? I noticed this with the UK. My mum and dad are from Lancashire and Yorkshire. I grew up with a lot of Northern English style, like words, right? And then I speak to somebody who grew up in like London or the South somewhere, and it's completely different, like slang or different verbiage, right? Now take that and come over to Canada, where I'm using a mixture and also having to learning all of these different slang and also different dialects, right? Even though it's the same language, so different, right? And so that piece around rules, coming back to rules, that was the culture shock for me. Was suddenly I felt like I was different for the first time in my life. I was made for the first time in my life, and that caused a lot of anger for me, and I couldn't express that anger. And oftentimes it was just I was cast as the different one, and that was it. And so for a long time, that caused a great deal of shame. That caused a great deal of not being able to vocalize what I was feeling, why I was feeling it, right? Coming back to that cultural piece and need to explain. And so for a very long time, one of the big pieces for me was when somebody asked me pardon. When I spoke and somebody said pardon, or what do you mean? And not being able to have space to explain, that caused a lot of issues for me. And it was only in therapy a few years ago that I was able to put those and click that together and put those two together. That was because of that experience way back.
It's painful sometimes how past experience stay with us and impact things that we don't always know.
Points.
Yeah. If I'm taking you back to the overall story, because this was one change, and you can definitely see now in retrospect how that impacted you. But you went through other changes that were not enforced on you, but you did this on your own accord.
Totally. So a little backtrack then. So high school, I was not giving a shit. That's my one swear word of today.
One swear word.
I wasn't caring because I wasn't stimulated. I might have anxiety, I might have all of these things, but I'm an intelligent person, right? That intelligence has to be supported though. And during like I said, the education system in Ontario was just dire when I was going through it. and specifically growing up in a small town, I wasn't being supported at all. So I would take classes like, for example, personal finance or maths, and I was just not succeeding in them and having to do summer school and things like that. And none of the teachers bothered to think of why, So I was just being passed along through. And so I just stopped caring. My grades were not what they could have been or what they should have been. I got to a point where I was like, okay, I'm thinking about university or college. What do I want to do? And I looked on the list and there was nothing. What I really wanted to do was what I just did in the past 2 years, which was history, medieval studies, religious studies, right? That's what I really wanted to do. But I was persuaded by both the school and my parents too, because they couldn't connect with it, not to do that. So I ended up going into social work. Biggest mistake, because although I enjoy working with people and I work with people now as a therapist, social work was not going to be a good thing for me. I did it because I thought I had to. So I went through, I did a college diploma for 2 years, wonderful time, beautiful people I worked with, but it wasn't me, it wasn't passion for me. By the end of my third year, I was dreading going into this profession. I didn't want to do it. And all that time, I didn't bother to think maybe I should switch out and do something else, right? That part of that conditional piece, I was paying for it myself, but also my parents were paying half of it too. So they got a say. So I dropped out, and for 5 years, I didn't know what I wanted to do because I had this bulk of training that I hadn't completed. I thought, well, I'll go back and do it eventually. That's what the therapy education was all about. I thought that will be a good thing to bridge. I can move into bridging all of these pieces together for myself. My interest in kind of Jungian and Freudian and transpersonal psychology really speaks to that religious studies and that spirituality piece for me, which was a huge thing for me. So I thought, that's a good bridging connector. And when I saw that potential, suddenly I became interested again. I was like, okay, this is good. I can do this. Because during high school, I wasn't receiving any of that sort of affirmation. One of the guidance counselors said flat out, your grades aren't good enough for university. You're not good enough for university. So you should just, do college instead.
I'm so angry.
Yeah.
It's such a repetitive story that...
Yeah. Yeah. It's true oftentimes. The system that is sabotaging us too, right?
Yeah.
When I look at my high school diploma and I look at the grades, what were some of my highest grades? 80s and 90s. History, religious studies, anything to do with culture, right? When I look at like STEM, like science, math, and whatnot, all lower 60s, right? So that should have been a clue. And go figure, I literally just graduated from a bachelor just like last week, literally. I finished in December. Thank you very much. Thank you. I went back, did it on my own over 2 years, finished off my degree, right? Paid for it by myself. So I don't have debt, which is good. When I look at my grades there, I graduated with honors, with distinction. I was at 85% GPA.
That's amazing. I love that you found the thing that's passionate for you. This is, so many people dream about doing their passion thing as like their life work. And it's such an amazing thing to say that you succeeded in doing that. But also for a lot of us, I'm going to put myself on the table here because I assume some people resonate with your story and some people would with mine. I love history. I love history of fashion. This was actually something I was considering when I was doing my bachelor's. But also I failed all the tests. Right. Due to my own neurodivergence, right? So for a lot of people, this finding how your brain functions and how that benefits you is great, because you have people with neurodivergency that are amazing in academia because they can find something that they're so passionate about and they can get into that like you, and it's so awesome to see it. But there's a variety there as well.
There's a huge variety, right? And I think that's a really crucial point, right? My success was based on me learning how I learn, right? Go figure, the two big things in my life right now, history and the humanities and therapy. What is the underlying component from both is story, right? When I'm sat with a client and I'm speaking to them about their story, I learn and I take in information because my brain operates best on story. there are three big things that like components that really latch on in there. It's the individual. I have an individual in front of me, a face, a symbol that I can latch the story onto, a story, and a context, right? Those are big pieces that my brain really latches onto and helps me to just soak information in. Same with history. When I'm learning about history, I'm looking at place, I'm looking at what happened and the people involved. And those three components then give me a very vivid image inside my head. So I can like just bring up information if you give me one of those components because the other two fit in. Mind mapping is a very big piece for me around that, right? Yeah. Go figure, it wouldn't work with maths because, you know, some people are very good with, for example, conceptual theoretical connections. They're looking more at connections between numbers or like language, the connection, relationship between words. They can mind map it all out inside their head and then understand. But story doesn't come into that for them. I'm sure it does, but it's a different form of story. So it's like learning how you learn was a big piece to that. And it sounds similar to your experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You are making my life so easy because you are just taking me pretty smoothly into our next subject, which is talking a bit more about solutions, because we went through a lot of your story and there's more to it, right? There's always more. We're not going to cover this in 45 minutes. Mm-hmm. And I want to hear from you maybe a bit more about mind mapping, other ideas that you think we should think about, solutions, tools.
Mm-hmm. One of my real interests related to story is how different therapy modalities show up in things that people naturally do anyways, or just doing anyways. One of the things that I've noticed, but my particular niche of therapy tends to be working with people who are queer or gender diverse, people who are working in the kink community and are involved with the kink community. Also people who are connected in with fandoms. So I noticed behind you, you've got a bobblehead from Fallout and Doctor Who, right?
I do. I have a bunch of stuff. I also have a Ravenclaw thing. And because I'm a Ravenclaw, and I'm going to put a push for this lovely thing from Rick and Morty, which is not just a thingamabob. It's a 3D print and design made by a friend of mine, and he's selling it. You've mentioned it. I'm putting it there. I'm plugging it there, in.
Right?
Yeah, very absolutely.
Good, very good. So there's a correlation between all of these. And it's starting to emerge to understand that there seems to be a correlation between these different communities. You get people who are involved usually in all of them, right? So you tend to find a lot of neurodiverse and people on the spectrum within fandoms. And it makes complete sense. They are really good like staging grounds for hyperfixations, right? You often find experts within those communities on these things. And, and speak to anybody in a fandom and they will just speak and speak and speak. And most of the time, many times, many of them will be on the spectrum. And that plays into that fixation, that fascination, that idea, right? And we see this throughout history, right? The people who are most probably were on the spectrum often will become experts in their field because they really hyperfixate and that becomes a big thing for them. So what's happening here then for therapy is looking at how are these then being staging grounds. There's a term named paracosm. It's a term basically for a fantasy world. It's the type of world that people enter into when they create them when children, right? But they become virtual spaces, basically. And we see this in video gaming. We see this in fandoms. We see this in any kind of creative endeavor. And so then the question is, how are people engaging? And so oftentimes they can be used for therapy. This is why I love narrative therapy so much. This is a really big part of my own work. Fan fiction writing, oftentimes the character will be a stand-in for the person, right? So then it becomes using these for that purpose, self-exploration. And I feel like a lot of people tend to do that anyways. They're safe spaces.
Basically, we're touching upon all of these inner universes, and we're talking about how people use them to find their place. How do you take this understanding and you use this as a tool? Take the good part of who you are as a neurodivergent.
Yeah. So We can use these tools with anybody, both neurodiverse and neurotypical. I think it works well with neurodiverse people because they're already in those trenches, they're already in those communities, right? And so then we use them as vehicles for the work. One of my favorites is I'll have a client in front of me who is starting to explore gender for themselves and their self-concept of gender. They will already have been a fan of, say, Steven Universe, the TV show Steven Universe. So then the question will become things like, tell me about the character you most connect with on Steven Universe. Tell me about them. What are the things that you're attracted to in that character? What are some of the story pieces that are compelling for you? And how does that relate to you? And so you bring it back to them. Oftentimes we see in characters aspects of ourselves that subconsciously we're aware of, but consciously we're not. We identify with characters. This happens throughout, like it doesn't have to be sci-fi or fantasy. It can be any form of media, any form of story.
Would you say it goes both ways? Because you mentioned like who do you resonate with, but you watch whatever it is that the content is that you're watching and you're experiencing whatever it is that you're experiencing. And a lot of times I have a lot of negative reaction to a character or to a story. How would you take that and learn from it?
It's the same thing. It's just then exploring what is it that you don't like about this character, right? And this is the issue with like redemption arcs, for example. Oftentimes redemption arcs are loved by people because those characters are ones that they dislike. And it's because there are aspects of self that they dislike, right? And so the redemption arcs almost creates a way for them to, or a blueprint for them to like those parts of themselves, right? Other people are very against redemption arcs because it's like, well, no, they're like that for a reason. And so if we redeem them in a way, then it just takes away the pain, the trauma, whatever that they've experienced, right? So it's both ways, right? And what's interesting is that oftentimes as we go through life, we'll find that our relationships shift with these characters. Like a lot of people in the gay community right now, they really love Ursula the witch from Little Mermaid because they can see, right, themselves in that character, right?
Yeah.
Whereas before 20 years ago, when they were the little Twinkies, they were Ariel, right? So it's interesting to see how then as we age and we go through life, how our relationships shift. How that then impacts like live action role play or fan fiction writing, or when people are actually creating their own characters, is to then look at that in the same way. What is it that really steps forward with this character? And that can often be a safe place for them to explore that. So that's how I bring it into therapy is that exploration piece, because people are doing this anyways, right?
I think it's a great tool. What I also like about your idea is that I can take it home even without a therapist and I can kickstart the process and get to a point that if I do choose to eventually get therapy, I can take it with me.
Very much so. This is where the self-therapy piece comes in, right? I feel a lot of people think that therapy is going to be the place that they solve their problems. I always underscore that therapy is a place that you can refine your own answers, because a lot of people are a lot smarter than they give themselves credit for. And this is where the whole piece around self-diagnosis comes in, right? As a therapist, I have to be very careful with the idea of self-diagnosis because in my scope of practice, I cannot diagnose, and that's really important. That being said, a lot of people in the autism community are self-diagnosing or are for self-diagnosis because when we're given language, one of two things happens. We totally ascribe to that symbol that we're given, which is the language that we're given. And usually that's the lens that we then see ourselves through. Another thing that happens is that there's a big relief that happens because when we see, diagnosis or list of symptoms or whatnot, we can often be like, oh yeah, that's me. There is danger in that because oftentimes there's issues around Dr. Google, for example, where people can be given a list of symptoms and in wanting to have a diagnosis as an explanation, they will say, yes, that's me. Well, that's kind of me. Or no, that's not me. But yeah, no, that is me. That kind of thing. So a lot of different things can happen. It depends on the individual. But I know particularly with autism, because I've had friends who've self-diagnosed and then went and had testing, very expensive testing done, and it's confirmed what they already knew, right? So what is it then? Just a little, a word on a piece of paper, right? But I think people can still engage with that if they're feeling like, this is a word that helps to describe them. And then there's a list of things that they can do to help to understand themselves better or to flow with it better. Then I think self-diagnosis has a good role to play. But I'm not telling people to self-diagnose. I have to be very careful with.
You don't have to in that case. But you are saying there are voices out there that support your self-diagnosis, and there is benefit that you can find from it. Yes. And I completely agree. I can see the benefit of both, and I can see the impact of both. And definitely, if you do that, be careful. I understand what you're saying.
It's one of those things, because depending on jurisdiction, that diagnosis can be a help or it can be a hindrance for you, right? And I know in Ontario, a lot of times that autism diagnosis, particularly the autism diagnosis, will get written down on a form and it will be placed into your file, and that file will be with you for the rest of your life, right? Just because of how the medical system is here. So a lot of parents are cautious about trying to get diagnosis for their kids because they don't want that to then close doors later on. And kind of speaking about other mental health issues, right? It's not an exact science. This is why they're constantly revising it. So, for example, Asperger's was a thing in DSM-4, but it's no longer a thing in DSM-5. So all of these people who were living their lives with that diagnosis of Asperger's, suddenly they don't have this anymore. And I know that caused a great deal of concern for people, because then it became an identity piece. Oh, I have Asperger's. This helps to explain who I am. This helps to explain how I can engage with the world. And now suddenly they don't have that diagnosis. And so then that question is, what is going on? So I think we have so many different things now people can use to explore themselves. Personality tests. We have lists upon lists, right? I think learning how you learn was my way of understanding this for myself. If you have a diagnosis or you don't have a diagnosis, learning how you think, learning how you conceptualize, learning about how you interact with the world in that way can really help you then find those strengths for yourself. So if you learn better, for example, and retain information through mind mapping, through storytelling, through relational information, then that's going to tell you then how you can use that for assisting in the rest of your life, right? The ways that you don't learn or how you don't retain information. So like dyscalculia. I'm not great with numbers. I know that. I understand that. So I know then I can go and get assistance with that if I need to, right? And so finding how you can better interact with the world. If you want to go and get a diagnosis, if you're feeling like you're on the spectrum or you have other form of neurodiversity, and a diagnosis can be helpful, there are all sorts of different programs out there, depending on jurisdiction, to assist you if the costs in your area are not great. But also understanding that you may not necessarily need a diagnosis either, right? Neurodiversity is just a part of a spectrum that also includes neurotypicality, right? Not seeing them as two different things. Seeing them as just along the same kind of axis.
These were amazing tips. This was an amazing life story that you shared with us that eventually led to you accomplishing so much of what you wanted. That is incredible. Yeah. And before we say goodbye, would you be willing to share a bit more about what you are on about, anything that's interesting on that aspect?
Definitely. So my published work all tends to be part of spirituality, history, folklore, and whatnot. So the book that I came out with was Ancestral Whispers, a guide to ancestral veneration practices. Really deals with kind of family issues and working with family story, but in a spiritual sense. Apart from that, I am a therapist. I am only taking people in the UK, unfortunately, just because of insurance stuff. I'm a private practice in the UK, and I also offer various different classes. I have a Patreon where you can subscribe and have access to my classes, which are both for therapy kind of classes, courses, and also folklore history courses too. So that's all available on benstimson.com. And yeah, that's really the best place to go is benstimson.com.
I absolutely agree that this is the best place. And there's so much information there and there's so much to be
I know.
used. I love it. We will be linking it below.
Thank you. This was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. And just to sum it up, everybody gets to know who you are, how you learn. And we're all going through this process. Some of us are more advanced than others. Some of us have reached our dream and some of us have not, but it doesn't mean that you're incapable. And I hope you found this interesting, and I'll meet you in the next one. Thank you again, Benjamin. Have a great day, everybody, and stay odd.